All right, we'll have time. I'll ask, since I'm running a few minutes late here myself, we'll take time for questions about the readings or things covered thus far on our break. So I'm just going to jump right in. So this morning we're going to pick up with the time frame with which we left off last time, which is the end of the age of the Apostolic Fathers, so the early 2nd century, and we're going to look at this sort of 100-year window spanning the 2nd century, kind of tippling into the early 3rd century today. I want to do a quick recap of sort of the through line of narrative of the last two lectures, just to both refresh yourselves and to also sort of place where we are on the storyline so far. So, I'm just going to read this, but this is just recap. The Christian synthesis is the recognition that Christ is the fulfillment of ancient Israel's prophecies, and that Israel itself has been reconstituted with Jesus at the head, and that now Gentiles can be fully a part of the people of God, that all people can now be reconciled to God because of what this Jesus did in dying on a cross and being raised to life. These acts reveal to humankind the true nature of God. So that was what we looked at, sort of the biblical witness, like what did the apostles testify has happened? This is what my best summary. This polis, this movement, grew up at first within the walls of Judaism, and after synthesizing and agreeing on how Jewish to remain, right, remember that, in the wake of the revelation of Jesus, they began to be distinguished from Judaism. No longer a subsect, the church, the Christians, began to be recognized as their own thing. More and more Greeks enter, Judaism distances itself, numbers increase enough that Imperial Rome recognizes the new religion as this sect called Christianity, and hates it. The news of Jesus' acts and his words continue to spread into all lands through the ministries of those who witnessed it, the apostles. And as they started dying, they wrote down their teaching and appointed leaders as their authorized successors. These apostolic fathers handed on the faith to the next generation, received the Old Testament as their book, and added New Testament writings alongside it. In their own writings, they, the apostolic fathers, codify and shine light on the same teaching and establishment manifest in the New Testament. For example, they sort of establish out of the New Testament teaching on ministry a threefold order. Out of New Testament teaching on communion, they talk more about the sacraments and the scriptures and things like that. Really, this text should be like that scrolling Star Wars text, just, you know, that where we've been. So that brings us to the early 2nd century. That all sounded pretty familiar, right? Good, okay. The theme of this century is, I take from Romans chapter 8, all things work together for good. Can you finish that verse? Anyone know the end of that verse? For those who love God, right? So what we see in the 2nd century is the theme that the church grows and develops in the face of opposition. And the opposition comes in two forms, from the outside and from the inside. So that's what we're going to be looking at in kind of two different sections together today. So first, there's opposition from the outside, and this is persecutions that the early church experiences. There are sort of famously established, there's sort of like 10 large-scale persecutions that are given names under the emperors who presided over them. The first 5 occurring sort of between the time of Peter and Paul and the end of our window this morning are these 5. And there's a slight, how to say it? I think there's sort of a picture when we think of church history about this sort of just unceasing persecution until Constantine, and that's not an accurate picture. So even to talk about 10 waves of persecution is a bit misleading because they were greatly different in size and scope. And also there were many regional persecutions which were not empire-wide, sort of less documented but could be just as cruel. And so this is sort of like a shirt that doesn't fit the data quite right, but it's the inherited shirt. So well, there it is. So for instance, Domitian, like the evidence for a severe persecution from him is small. Whereas with Severus, we know that like his was actually sort of imperially mandated, and we get witness to it in many different quadrants of the Roman Empire. So these are not all of the same scope, but they come in sort of bursts. You notice there's kind of a generation or two between these, and they produce famous martyrs. So Peter and Paul famously died under Nero. Ignatius of Antioch, whose epistles we looked at last week, he was martyred under Trajan. Under Marcus Aurelius, Polycarp and the martyrs of Lyon, under Severus, Perpetua and Felicity. These are names you might have seen in art, religious art of the Middle Ages, in architecture. And so there's these martyrs from each of these persecutions. The persecutions have an interesting effect. The intent was to quell the movement, and unlike sort of, I suppose, resistance training and exercise, it actually strengthened the movement. So what we see from each of these, both empire-wide and regional bursts of opposition to the church, within the church, we see these things develop. A sense of other identity, right? So let's say you're a Roman citizen. You're kind of proud of your Roman citizenship. And all of a sudden, the empire starts persecuting you because of your Christian identity. That kind of helps you draw the line in the sand of like, okay, I'm definitely a Christian first and a Roman second. That sense of the otherworldliness and the political identity of being a part of the church got further deepened when the sort of visible polis was coming against you, right? I mean, nations war against nations, and when the empire is coming at you, it actually affirms in some way your own corporate identity. And with that, a sense of connection to others in the church. The sort of the bond between traveling Christians, when Christians would travel city to city, when you'd encounter other groups, there was a sense of connection, like we're all under the same opposition. The sort of famous, so to me, what's like the archetypal sociology of this is like, whoever the group of soldiers you were with at boot camp, when you got the drill instructor yelling at you, you all bond together under that resistance, right, under that opposition. And it's a similar thing in the church. Also, there's this a development of a sort of theological thinking of this new category called martyrdom. The word martyr means witness, and in the New Testament it always means witness in the sense of like a legal witness in a court case, except by the time of John's revelation, where the word seems to have overtones of those who've died for that witness. So that's where we get the first trace of the word martyr, not just meaning court witness, but actually someone who died for the integrity of that witness. That starts to get thought about, and whereas you could think, I mean, think about any group. If you have a bunch of your leaders executed, you'd usually think, man, this group is not going to do well. Like, that's really hurting us. But it actually gets sort of turned around, and it's like, wow, our leaders suffered the same fate as our master, Jesus. In fact, look at the writings. Jesus actually predicted that this would happen to us, and that sort of confidence that came from that. And so, far from kiboshing the leaders in the movement, they actually sort of heightened the sort of sense of the dignity of the movement, and especially of the leaders who died. We're going to look at an instance of that in a second. And then, when there were sort of outbursts of persecution, many people suffered. Other people sort of practically was like, well, hey, I got family in the next town over, in the next district where there are not as much, the persecutions are being less severely enforced, let's say. And so people moved around, and there was fleeing. And with that geographic spread, well, then they make new neighbors and new friends, and this witness of Jesus and what happened kind of actually spreads because of the physical persecution. It spreads geographically because of the persecution. So talk about things that the Roman Empire did not foresee happening from their cruelties. So speaking of the cruelties, I want to just give a picture of sort of when I say persecutions, what is this? So this is not written by a Christian author. Tacitus is avowedly a non-Christian, doesn't like Christians. He writes the Annals, which are sort of this, they are a critical commentary on the Roman Empire. He's not sort of like, hoorah, rah, Rome! He's really sort of like picking apart the leaders, but he's a good historian. And so this is what the history he gives us in Nero's day. So therefore, to stop the rumor that Nero had set Rome, sorry, let me scratch back. There was a huge fire, destroyed a third of Rome in AD 63, I think. And there was this rumor going around that actually historians think might be true, is that Nero started it. And so Nero, to stop the rumor that he'd set the fire, Nero falsely charged with guilt and punished with the most fearful tortures the persons called Christians, who were generally hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of that name, we looked at a portion of this quote 2 weeks ago. So he talks about, I don't want to read this whole thing, but in their very deaths, they were made the subjects of sport. They were covered with the hides of wild beasts and worried to death by dogs. This is a public domain 19th century translation of the Latin. So that's worried meaning torn to death. Nailed to crosses or set fire to. And when the day waned, burned to serve for the evening lights. They were set on posts and set aflame, and the fat in the human body was the candle. Nero offered his own garden players for the spectacle and exhibited a Circensian game, indiscriminately mingling with the common people in the dress of a charioteer. And so it goes on. So this is pretty vicious, right? I mean, it's pretty cruel. Yeah?
We've been playing with Roman candles as fireworks for years.
Huh, yeah.
But this is where it said fire to, is where the term Roman candle came from.
Wow, I did not know that. That sort of gives a dark shadow to an otherwise festive tool. I did not know that. There was a movie done last year, actually earlier this year, I think, with Jim Caviezel, the actor that Mel Gibson recruited for The Passion of the Christ, called Paul, Apostle of Christ. And as a historical glimpse into sort of just putting because we're a very visual culture in this, movie Hollywood age, to sort of see the textures of Rome and the smells in that climate, and they portray sort of the era of the 60s, and Paul's an old man, and they actually show some of these men being burned, and it's brutal to watch, even for a split second that it's on screen. But I recommend that movie if you want to sort of look into Nero's Rome. It gives best as I've studied the history, I thought the movie didn't take hardly any liberties. It was pretty accurate. There was a question over here. Good question. 19th century English is full of interesting flourishes. I don't know exactly, but I know that Tacitus, the other Roman commentators on Christianity, they thought that Christianity there was something sort of disgusting about it, that it was in calling everybody brother and having these love feasts, these festivals where you share your food, and there's complete disregard for social class. It was sort of viewed the way I understand sort of some of the view of the hippies in the 70s looked at, like, what are they doing? Like, that's just gross. So I think that's the range of that word there. I don't know, I know neither the 19th century range of the English word nor what Latin word is used, so I can't really comment specifically. Yeah? Oh, could be. So yeah, that's a good possible etymology. I don't know. I'll take it. So that was Nero in the 60s, Marcus Aurelius in the 160s, so this is 100 years later, the more things change. Polycarp is one of the most beloved figures of this era. He was a disciple of John, the elder, who purportedly, as we talked about last week, but purportedly is the traditional author of the books that bear his name in the Bible. So this is a martyrdom account that comes very early. Our textual sources for it are very close to the date. So even though there are things fantastical in this report, it has less of the sort of standard embellishments we see in medieval hagiography. That's called the word for writing about the saints. But so this is Polycarp, and he was martyred when he was in his late 80s or early 90s. So he's brought before the proconsul, and they tried to say, have respect to thine age, and other things in accordance therewith, as is they want to say. Swear by the genius of Caesar, repent and say, away with the atheists. I love this. Then Polycarp, with solemn countenance, looked upon the whole multitude of lawless heathen that were in the stadium, and waved his hand to them, and groaning, and looking up to heaven, he said, away with the atheists. Right? They're saying the Christians were accused of being atheists because they wouldn't worship the state-sanctioned gods, the sort of modified Greek pantheon, and the Roman deities like the emperors who'd been elevated like Augustus to a divine status. Because Christians wouldn't swear to what they believed were false gods, they were called atheists. Interestingly, prefigured in a sort of secular picture by Socrates, right? Who was executed because, what was Socrates' charge, do you remember? Atheism. Because he didn't believe in all these sort of household deities. So they're saying, reject the Christians that we call atheists. And he's saying, no, you guys are the atheists because you don't believe in the one true God. But when the magistrate pressed him hard and said, swear the oath and I'll release thee, revile the Christ. So that was what was needed to get out of sentencing. It was just to sort of verbally say you rejected Jesus. Polycarp, remember, an old man says, 66 years have I been his servant, and he hath done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And remember, Polycarp never saw Jesus with his own eyes. Right? He's talking about someone he's never seen with his eyes. But he says, he has been good to me for as long as he's been a Christian, which is 86 years. How could he blaspheme my king who saved me? And this is from a few paragraphs later. He is sentenced to execution, and he gets set on fire, but there's this weird thing that the fire, it says, what does it say? Here you go. The fire sort of looped around him in this sort of weird natural phenomenon, and it says that his flesh, and it was there in the midst, not like flesh burning, but like a loaf in the oven, his body was described as, or gold and silver refined in a furnace, and it gave a fragrant smell. Now, certainly to a secular historian, he'd be like, this is just fanciful, pietistic reading into what happened. And it may be. This doesn't come with divine sanction. This is just a human writing. But it also may be the case. There's, in fact, Christians that believe that this really did happen, as it's reported, and that there was this sort of miraculous showing forth that this was no ordinary man being killed. So yeah, and then look at it again, sort of this man's been killed, but he's called the glorious martyr, the glorious witness, Polycarp, who was found an apostolic, kind of continuing, here 100 years later, past the apostles, and prophetic teacher in our own time, a bishop of the Holy Church in Smyrna. Every word which he uttered from his mouth was accomplished and will be accomplished. So this revere for their local leader, the martyrdom was written by his generation of disciples, this revere for what he suffered. So those are sort of two glimpses of persecution. There are countless unknown names and people who were martyred in the different persecutions, martyred or maimed. As we're going to see in a couple of weeks at the Council of Nicaea, almost all the bishops who showed up at that council had a crippled limb from being tortured. Either a tongue cut out, a hand had been crushed, or a leg crushed. They just were really cruel. So there's all this opposition, not only killing, but other opposition. So that's sort of the pressure from the outside, which nevertheless thickens the vigor of the Christians and actually spreads and strengthens the church's self-identity. The second century is also rife with not only opposition from the outside, but opposition from the inside. Because as the church grows, partly because of the sort of pressure from persecution, it becomes this larger body, both in numbers and geographical spread. And as anyone who's tried to lead a geographically spread organization will tell you, there's then more room for weeds to grow up, so to speak, and internal contests for local leadership, for identity. Which story is the right story? Like when we tell a narrative think about the way you tell the story about your neighborhood or Auburn University or the South, like which story is the one that will prevail? Which one's actually more accurate to the facts, right? These things get contested from time to time, and it just so with the church. And so what we have is not only opposition from outside, opposition from the inside under the name of heresies. Now, when we hear that word, I think probably most of you, if you're like me, kind of conjure up visions of the Spanish Inquisition in the 16th century and, heresy, like burn him, like this sort of very hierarchical, heavy-handed sort of point the finger, what was that phrase? Auto de fe sort of things from Spain. That's actually not the freight of the word in the earliest days of the church. It actually comes from the simple Greek word to choose, right? You could actually translate sort of more literally into modern English. The word heresy is just thing chosen by oneself. It was the name given to something that was considered to be just idiosyncratic and a personal choice away from what had been received. There was this great value, as we saw last time, on both leadership and teaching being sort of organically succeeded one person to the next. And so what's interesting is in our religious climate, this is actually sort of like the very foundation on which religious choices are made now, right? Like, well, what do I choose? I will choose my religion and which church I will go to. In the olden days, that was called heresy. Yeah, and the nature of the choices that can be made can be broken down into three not so simple categories. So you could choose to reject the Christian synthesis and choose something other than like this sort of Jewish-rooted but modified Jewish Pauline Christian thing that really gets cemented in the Council of Jerusalem in the year 49. You could choose against that. You could choose against the claims made by Jesus and about Jesus, either his claims about his humanity or his divinity. In fact, you could actually challenge what this reveals about God generally, whether he is united or what the distinctions within himself are. So all heresies fall into sort of challenging one of these three things, like Jewish roots, Jesus' humanity or divinity, or just about God generally, about his oneness or his threeness. All heresies are sort of picking and choosing apart from these things. And each one of them, each one of these choices, it defines itself as either a taking away from the deposit of faith, to use the language that Paul uses to his disciple Timothy, to either taking away from the deposit or adding to the deposit. The heresies, and sometimes there's a mixture of both. And so I want to catalog some of the things that spring up kind of within the walls of the church in the 2nd century and sort of define them by sort of taking note of what they do, either take or add. And just a little note on this, the scriptures, actually, the New Testament writings, actually speak about this pretty clearly. John, in the last chapter of the last book of the New Testament, writes this. I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book, if anyone adds to them, beep, 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 God will add to him the plagues described in the book. And if anyone takes away, beep, 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 from the words of the book of this, that's just a typo, book of this prophecy, God will take away his share in the tree of life and in the holy city. So there's actually this sort of paradigm of adding and taking away gets introduced by the very last of the living apostles, which I think is very prescient. So let's look at the great heresies of the 2nd century. They are these 5. Ebionitism, Docetism, Marcionism, Gnosticism, and Adoptionism. Some of these take the name from like a heresiarch, which is a great title, although a terrible thing to be, that means you sort of originated a heresy, so Marcion is the origin. Some take the name from sort of a system of thought. If you know Greek, Gnostic comes from the word gnosis, those who thought they had a special knowledge. And then, actually, all of them, only the middle one, Marcionism, is named after a man. The rest are after the ideas, although Ebionitism is named after a place from a region, I think, of Ebion. Okay, I just said that. So Ebionitism is an attempt to take away from the Christian synthesis. So this is sort of, I mentioned these by name, I think, a lecture ago. These were the ones who, when there's sort of this Christian, Judeo-rooted Christian thing emerges, there was a group that said, nope, we've just abandoned too much of our Jewish roots. We've got to go back and keep the Old Testament law as binding moral code for Christ followers. So this is a distinct, this is not a movement within Judaism. It's a movement within the Christian church that wants to sort of step back from the synthesis really pioneered by St. Paul and return to the Old Testament law as binding. All males need to be circumcised. Sabbath needs to be kept with sort of extreme dutifulness. Temple sacrifices as long as that was possible. Things like that. They rejected the canonical Gospels, especially Mark and Luke, because they record Jesus saying in no uncertain terms, the law is being modified in your midst through his own ministry. They seem to have had their rewritten Gospels, their own rewritten Gospel. Maybe the scholars think maybe it was an adaptation of Matthew. So that's Ebionitism. Docetism, this minus sign here means it's also a taking away, was the belief that God couldn't really have taken on flesh. So this is sort of a philosophical quandary based on the idea of sort of a philosophical commitment that God is impassible, that God can't suffer. So Jesus couldn't have been, what's interesting, they thought that not that he couldn't have been God, but that he couldn't have been really human, because then he would have really suffered, and God can't suffer. So because of logic, and I want to flag this because we're going to see this a lot through the next few lectures, logic becomes the stumbling block, because that's perfectly logical, right? God can't suffer. Jesus, they didn't doubt actually that Jesus was God, because they were near enough to the apostolic witness of his powerful deeds and the living memory of people who said, no, I had died and I was raised back from the dead, like Lazarus or the widow's son. So they didn't doubt his divinity. They said, he couldn't have been human because then he would have really suffered, and God can't suffer, ergo, he must have just appeared to be a human, like some sort of a phantasm, like a trick of the senses. Like he looked like a man, but really it was an angelic body that couldn't suffer. It just looks like it was suffering. Ignatius of Antioch writes against these guys. It's really interesting that when people sort of, again, Dan Brown is just sort of, it's just such a tragedy in our day. This idea that sort of the church invented the idea of Jesus' divinity, when we see sort of antagonists to the church assuming divinity, it actually sort of throws in sort of negative relief, right? The boldness of the church's early claims. So whether or not Dan Brown doesn't have to believe Jesus is God, you know, I'm not, but to say that the early church didn't believe it, that's where he's wrong. So that's Docetism. Marcionism is very interesting. It's sort of this strange mixture of taking away and adding. So track this one with me. So Marcion is this guy, his dad's a bishop. It's hard getting biographical data on heresiarchs because there's sort of this impulse to really demonize them, right? It's like, oh yeah, look what he did. He must have had this really sordid past. So maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but traditionally he's understood to have been promiscuous sexually and therefore been sort of excommunicated by his own dad, goes to Rome, and he was reading the Old Testament a lot, and he just couldn't reconcile the Old Testament with the gospel of Jesus. And he said, there's just two different portraits here. This has got to be about two different gods. Logically, ding, 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 a problem word, we can solve that. We could say there's sort of the arch-god who has this sort of underling demiurge, who's some sort of weird quasi-demonic figure, who's responsible for creation and who has showed up to Moses and kind of gave him the law. Interesting that a man maybe who had trouble keeping the rules was trying to come against the law. Then the real highest God revealed himself in Jesus Christ. I'm taking the time to sort of explain this because this is actually the foundational paradigm of Gnosticism, this element of Gnostic doctrine, this sort of two gods idea, that there's like the arch good God that's like super ethereal and far away, and then some sort of lower, more accessible, but more pan-like God, who then Marcion says, that's the guy that Moses encountered. It would be genius if it wasn't so wrong and so wrong-headed and wicked. But one of the things it right away did was it was full of anti-Semitism. Marcion actually took his scissors to the New Testament and tried to cut out any references to the Old Testament. Because if the Old Testament comes from the sort of pan-like demiurge, who wants those writings? Give us the pure stuff. And so he tried to sort of purge the Jewish stuff out of it. I mean, yeah, the resonance in our day is chilling. So he tried to cut it, the Old Testament, and then add in this Gnostic paradigm to account for that. And so he's actually rejecting to the Jewish synthesis not by stepping back, but by saying it didn't go far enough. Like we need to like fully sever ourselves from that Jewish heritage, and the Christian church needs to be a Greek philosophical movement. It's interesting that Greek men who probably didn't even know that many Jewish people came and attacked Marcion vigorously with their rhetoric. So we're going to look at that in just a bit too. A question? I want to say, that's a good question. So the history of John's Gospel and where geographically it's known and in what times and stuff, I've heard an answer to this question. I'm just trying, like, racking the archives of memory. I want to say it's Luke is his beloved Gospel because it was written to a Gentile audience by a Greek. So the Greek is really polished, and he relies much less on Old Testament citation, whereas Matthew quotes the Old Testament like every chapter. Yeah, it was Luke. So, but it would be I bet there's a really interesting paper out there on Marcion's use of John, because John's a mixed bag, because you have some sort of stuff that would be catnip to a Platonic dualist, right? Like darkness and light, and the light came down, but then you also have a lot of references to Yahweh of the Old Testament. So I don't know. I wonder what Marcion's relationship with John was. I guess it was complicated, but I'm pretty sure, if memory serves me, Luke was the one where he said, this is the gospel we should really just base our faith on. Really, really insightful question. Gnosticism, I've already named some of these ideas. What's interesting about Gnosticism is one of the things that was popular in the 1st and 2nd centuries of Rome was this sort of revival of Egyptian mystery religion. So religious historians, I mean secular historians outside of Christianity of late antiquity portray some very interesting pictures that sort of the Romans of the 1st and 2nd century, they're not sort of credulous and gullible about the pantheon. They know that their stories of Zeus, or for them Jupiter, and all these are kind of made up, but they're, it's a reason to have a feast, and it's a nice statue in your house, and hey, it can't hurt. Like there was this sort of like distance and sort of ironic thing about it. But in the wake of that sort of, you could say, demythologization, what we always see then is there's an inherent human need for religion and religious ritual, so they actually started kind of appealing to these weird mystery religions that had kind of been fringe, kind of started to get a bit more popular. The sort of closest equation in our day might be something like the Masons or something, where it's like, give me some rituals and some liturgies and some structures that are kind of esoteric with lots of moon and sun symbolism and animal imagery and, throw in a bit of like a blood sacrifice. I'm not saying the Masons do that. The Egyptians did that. So Gnosticism is sort of a general term. Even though there were people who said, I am a Gnostic, meaning I am an enlightened one, it wasn't the name for a religion as much as sort of after-the-fact category for a whole scattershot of different religious wellsprings in the 1st and 2nd century. They have a lot of things in common. In general, they agree that physical matter is bad and has its source in some evil demigod, but that the spirit, the life of the intellect and mind, is good. So what you see, for instance, in Plotinus, what they call Neoplatonism, is sort of Platonic philosophy sprinkled in with sort of Gnostic impulses. So there's this idea that knowledge is everything. So they're all about the life of the mind. But what's interesting is they're a very elitist group. All Gnostics, they're not egalitarian. The way we think of knowledge as a sort of egalitarian impulse. They were very clear. They were like, some people have the spark of the archon and some do not, and I do. And there was this sort of, they were like, oh, you lower castes, you'll just never understand the philosophy that I understand. And it was very decadent. And what was interesting is, even though they said the life of the mind is everything, in a way, morally, that severed them from a rigorous discipline of the body. And so some of the Gnostic groups actually were sort of the big partiers. I mean, they were the ones who threw these sort of like bacchanalias and stuff. And they justified it as the body doesn't matter, let's just have fun with it. And it's like, well, very convenient. And they developed these elaborate cosmologies, sort of like that the universe has 30 sort of layers of gods and angels you have to sort of ascend through, and when you get up there. And so when you read it now, if you read Irenaeus' Against the Heresies, written in the 170s, he kind of takes on point by point these guys, and it's crazy the stuff that people are willing to believe about, like the great snake and who's been lying dormant and all these different things that they sort of got on board. So there was magical rituals involved. But the interesting thing is that they claimed, and here's the sort of the part where it intersects with Christian history, is there were people who were sort of interested at some level in Gnosticism, and they integrated it with some of Christian teaching. Yeah.
I think I've read where this Gospel of Thomas was
Yeah.
supposed to be Gnostic, but I don't get any of this stuff out of it.
Yeah.
He just seemed to write a gospel based on different experience, whatever it was.
Right.
What was it like what you're describing?
Right, yes. So how many of you have heard of the Gospel of Thomas? Okay, yeah. So there are a collection of writings found in the Nag Hammadi depository of writings in Egypt. And those writings span a range of time frame. And many of them have the title, the Gospel of fill in the blank. So there's Gospel of Thomas, and there's like 10 or 11 or so other Gospels that take the name Gospel. And I've not studied each of them in part, so I can't remember the names, but there's like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the Gospel of Judas, and the Gospel of Peter. There's all these different Gospels, right? Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of, most all of those Gospels, in fact, all of them, with the exception of the Gospel of Thomas, all of them have a sort of 3rd or 4th century origin and are full of this sort of stuff, like magical. But the Gospel of Thomas stands apart, but it was found in the same corpus of texts. So sometimes the Gospel of Thomas is called a Gnostic Gospel because it was found in a big stack of very Gnostic Gospels. But the Gospel of Thomas is very interesting because it actually contains more than any of the other ones that play the name of Gospel, similar content to the canonical Gospels. And then these additional stories, which sort of fall into two categories. Some are kind of filling in the gaps. I think of it like fan fiction. Like the Gospels we have don't say much about Jesus' childhood. So whoever penned the Gospel of Thomas, and scholars debate the date. At the very earliest, it's sort of mid to late 2nd century. Some scholars still put it in the 4th century with the other ones. But they say So for instance, there's these stories about Jesus as a child, like making a pigeon out of clay and breathing life into it. And it's like, it's interesting when you read it, it lacks some of the narrative realness. When you actually compare the so-called Gospels with the canonical four Gospels, you notice then all these geographical and time markers that make the canonical Gospels read like history, not sort of ultra-scrupulous sort of like this happened and then this happened and then this happened the way history is done today, but still a sense of it happened in this time, in this hill, with these people around. And the Gnostic Gospels don't have, like with all of the accounts in the canonical Gospels, you can reasonably deduce, this story must have come from this person who was there, who in fact we know was an accomplice of this person. You know, we can kind of put those dots together. Gnostic Gospels, not so much. But then what's interesting is, in the Gospel of Thomas, at one of the resurrection appearances, Jesus appears as just a giant 6-foot-tall floating head to the disciples and speaks like an oracle to them. And it's interesting because a laser show, right? And so it's interesting when you look at that compared to the canonical accounts, where Jesus shows them and just looks like a man. There actually is a devaluation of the body, because what does the head hold? The mind, right? This sort of like, he's now just pure mind, you know, no body encumbering him. When in fact the canonical Gospels, he says, give me some fish, I can eat, you know, like, which is different. So, yeah, a good question. So there's not, and so they get integrated. And what's interesting then is these two sort of arch-heresiarchs in the mid to late 2nd century, they kind of start teaching all this teaching, and they say like, look, Jesus actually taught in secret all the stuff I'm telling you about the 30 archons and the dualism, and he entrusted this secret knowledge to us. So don't listen to those bishops, you know, Irenaeus and those guys. They're just telling you stories. They don't want you to know the real truth, right? If you know your Bible, what does that sound like, right? Like the serpent in the garden, interestingly. But that was what they claimed, and that had a sort of allure. They attracted a lot of followers. These were not small movements. They were popular. And then what was interesting is the church, and here's where we'll kind of land today, is how does the church respond to that? Because when someone says, here's the true story, no, this is the true story, you can't just go, yes it is, no it isn't, yes it is, no it isn't, right? There's kind of, what's the court of appeal? And we're going to, on a cliffhanger a little bit, to look at sort of, how do you solve that? Because if you see the problem, the solution's even more satisfying. Yeah?
Well, you say that the Gnostics thought some were made to be saved, some damned.
Yep.
It's sort of like it really is predestination approach.
That's interesting.
Elect.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about that connection. I suppose there is a sort of, in outcome, you could see some sort of similar elitism at like a sociological level. But they grounded their teaching not in scriptures, but actually in their cosmology, which was that they thought that they really relied heavily on the God is light imagery. And they believed that these sparks of the archon of light inhabited your soul in more or less degrees, and that they made that there were 3 categories of people: the fleshly people, the psychical people, and then the truly spiritual people. And it was based on how much of that light you had. And so they said you were born with it and you were stuck. So in some ways, it was actually just a reinforcement of a class system. Like there weren't a lot of poor Gnostics. It was sort of the decadent religion of the elite in some way. And Calvinism was popular kind of actually was popular with the poor. You know, so there was a difference there maybe too. So, yeah. I like the connections there. So then another heresy that kind of springs up is this adoptionism. And this is a takeaway from the received sort of the faith as it had been received. And it's the first that tries to shirk the claim that Jesus is fully God, and they try and say, no, Jesus gets adopted as God. Like he begins as a man, but at the baptism of John, when there's that vision of the bird, that's when he gets adopted. The trouble is, this doesn't square very well with a handful of passages of Jesus according to Jesus' own testimony. For instance, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, remember Abraham existed 2,200 years before Jesus, I am, echoing Yahweh's words to Moses on Sinai, right? I am who I am. So this is like a good logical theory, because one of the problems, I think this also sort of springs up really from sort of received monotheistic heritage, whether Greek or Jewish doesn't matter. But if God is one, how can there be 2 of them, right? That's a problem which we're going to see explode in the 3rd century. But one of the first ways to sort of solve that was, well, there was one God, and then this guy gets like adopted to be sort of second in command. And the trouble is, it just doesn't square with the original data, even as it's more logical. And then, for instance, John 5, John says, this is why the Jews were seeking to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. There's not a subordinated sort of, come alongside. There was a claim to equality that John says is part of why they wanted to kill Jesus in the first place. So this is, of all the heresies, I've actually not studied this one a lot, so I couldn't name for you who the heresiarchs are or where it was regionally, so I'm just going to move on. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah. So they definitely had origins in specific regions. So we know Marcion was in Rome, and his biggest followers were in Rome, but then because Rome was a big city of commerce and travel, it then got exported to sort of indistinct towns. So that one had a pretty wide range. And so we can kind of see some of them flourishing, sort of, you might get some side by side in the same city as sort of alternate competing sects of like, there's sort of the traditional Christianity, and then there's sort of Marcionism over here, or maybe adoptionism over here, and then they might sort of cross-pollinate a little bit. What we see sort of in the development of heresies is sort of grabbing bits and pieces that kind of work for each other's arguments and sort of refashioning themselves like a kind of a Frankenstein, and then kind of presenting a new challenge to the church because it's a new hybrid. It's prioritizing different arguments. So I suppose a quick history survey looks like this makes it look like, well, are there all these different groups with kind of clearly identified, like, hi, I'm Ben, and I follow Basilides. Actually, in the case of Basilides, people did do that, not with name tags, but in terms of claiming their origin. But with adoptionism, there were people like, I'm an adoptionist. They would sort of explain and sort of propagate, no, here's how we're to read the scriptures. And so some have more sort of structure and codification to them. Marcion would be one of those. Some are sort of loose assemblages of bad thought that sort of get opposed by other teachers. Adoptionism would be one like that. So they're not all like sort of equal size and scope, and they're not all sort of pan-Roman Empire. Marcion is probably the only one which gets sort of empire-wide news coverage. Docetism seems to be unique to Syria, for instance, so we don't see Docetism really outside of Syria. So like the persecutions, they're different size and scope. Does that hit on what you're asking? The major, good question. Definitely minorities by numbers of followers. I think there's no historical problem with saying they're the minorities. Some get large enough where they attract they become preoccupying to the majority, and Marcionism would be one of those. A lot of teachers and writers are speaking against him. That's true in the 2nd century, sort of the mainstream is the norm. What we're going to see in the 4th century is actually the heresy becomes the majority with Arianism. So there are times in the church's life where by numbers, in terms of numbers of leaders and numbers of followers, the false teaching actually sort of is regnant. And then it dies away, which is interesting. So we'll look at that in particular in a few lectures' time. But it actually sharpens the question, as we might think one way to solve the question of which narrative is the right one. Did Jesus really relay a secret message to the true apostles, which Basilides is the successor of, and it's not written down, but only you can get it just from him? Is that the true story, or is it true, or is the mainstream true? And you could say, well, maybe numbers could decide it. Are these just on the fringe and we don't need to worry about it? And actually, numbers don't decide it, as we'll see in the 4th century. If it was a vote, we'd be Arians in the church now, because it was the majority. So that actually sharpens the question. So thank you for that segue. Because here's what I think, how the church answers it in terms of how do we know which is the true story? Not just sort of because we want to be right, but both to prove to ourselves and to the others who are looking on which narrative more credibly accounts for the data. So that's what we're going to look at. So it's not that sort of, well, you could be traditional or Basilidean. It's like, well, those actually, it's apples and oranges, but how do you tell? And that's what I hope to look at. we'll take a break in just a minute. There are a number of great teachers of the 2nd century. There's a group, how many of you ever heard the phrase the Church Fathers? You ever heard that phrase? So that phrase refers to a group of teachers, dozens and dozens of teachers kind of spanning from the 2nd through really to the 8th century, who sort of, sometimes they take on a specific false teaching and sort of develop a very dexterous argument against it. Sometimes they're just famed as good preachers. John Chrysostom his sermons are still read today because they're just great preaching. This is the group called the Fathers. A study of the Fathers is called patristics, from the Latin pater. And these guys emerge in the 2nd century. So Justin Martyr in Rome, Irenaeus of Lyon in today France, Tertullian in North Africa, Hippolytus in Rome and North Africa, Origen in Egypt, and Clement, is he his student or his teacher? His student? No, his teacher in Alexandria. So these guys are all mid to late 2nd century fathers. What I want to do after our break is just touch on their lives and then try and answer the question of how do they answer the heretics. So we'll take an 8-minute break for a bathroom and water, whatever you need. We'll regather and we'll touch base with the fathers. And if you don't need the bathroom or anything and would like to just chat, feel free to come and ask a question up front. We'll gather back up. So I'm going to clip through some biographies because biographies just aren't that interesting to read by themselves. But these slides are, test, how many of you still have not received an email from me? Great, it worked, okay. So you're welcome to look back at some of these if you want to. And Wikipedia is a pretty, I actually love Wikipedia. I've given money to them once upon a time, but no, I did not know that. Nice. I love Wikipedia. It's okay. It's pretty good for bare-bone facts, but on matters, because Christian history necessarily involves miraculous claims, right? Wikipedia, rightly so for the job it's trying to do, takes the most skeptical angle against those claims. So if you're interested in studying these things with a little bit of sympathy for the narrative on the inside, I would recommend that the other online encyclopedia hosted at New Advent. It's a website called New Advent, and it's just some guy who's dutifully hand-typed in the 1911 Roman Catholic 18-volume encyclopedia. But you can search in there Tertullian and get a biography and writings and historical setting, and it's every bit as academic, but it includes some of the more in-house detail, like a miracle story or something, which Wikipedia would happily omit. So New Advent's a good biographical resource. New Advent, I forget I think it's newadvent.org, not .com. But if you just Google New Advent, you'll find it. So what I want to say about these guys is they approach the faith from different ways. And it's actually, I'm going to send you a link to a lecture today for next time by the great patristic scholar of our era, John Baer, who combats this narrative that the early church was heavy-handed in trying to sort of, no, we got one way, do it one way, and actually highlights some of actually sort of the Puritanism of the heresies and actually the breadth of orthodoxy. So I'm going to send you that lecture. But these guys come out with all different kinds of work. So some of these guys are philosophers, Origen and Justin. These are trained philosophers, and they know their stuff, and they write magnificently. And they're really compelling to academics. Justin Martyr argued in Rome, and actually he's considered one of the first apologists, meaning making a defense of the faith. And he loved arguing with the Greeks. Tertullian, on the other hand, is this like holy curmudgeon in North Africa who literally says, I have no use for apologies or apologetics, just believe it, right? And then Hippolytus is like this kind of political figure, I mean, not in civil politics, but in the church, and he's kind of torn between these like, the issues of who's going to be the successor of Rome, and he gets sent to the salt mines and records some of the liturgies of his day. He's more of a liturgist, and then Irenaeus of Lyon is this missionary who's out in France, and he's just trying to spread the gospel like Peter and Paul did, and he's countering all these crazy ideas, and he has to like write against them, and he's got martyrs in his city, and so you kind of all these different walks of life. So on these slides, I've tried to include sort of what's their most famous work. All of these are public domain online. I mean, they're in these Victorian translations that are a little hard to read, but they're still free if you want to get a taste. And some of them are in the writings of the textbook that we have. And then also kind of a quote that people think of often when they think of the guy. So this is Justin Martyr. This dialogue with Trypho is interesting. This full name is Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, and it's a sort of fictional dialogue, but presumably based on exchanges he had with Jews in Rome, because there was always been a large Jewish presence in Rome in antiquity, except when they were expelled from time to time. But what's interesting is it's this whole back and forth about who has the better interpretation of the Old Testament. So Trypho says, no. Isaiah chapter 9 is about Hezekiah, about you, behold, you'll conceive a son born of a virgin. And Justin says, let's look at it more closely. Hezekiah doesn't fulfill the details of that. And he says it's about Jesus. So very interesting in terms of warring over whose Old Testament is it right away. And then his apology is to the Greeks, trying to make this sort of winsome defense of like, here's why. He actually says, the revelation of Christianity is the fulfillment of all philosophy that came before. It's the apex, the culmination, and sort of says, if you want to be maximally intelligent and smart and philosophical, be a Christian. And part of that is, I love this quote, when Christ preached in Hades, so what he's referencing there is Peter writes in 1 Peter that when Jesus dies, he went down into Hades and preached to the dead. Actually, scratch that. It says, he proclaimed to the souls in prison. And the best New Testament scholarship I've read says that was a victory lap around the sort of archdemons that were cast out in Noah's day. But that's kind of lost to a 21st century ear. It was slightly lost to Justin, who sort of interprets it as preaching in Hades. But he says Socrates would have been the first to receive the gospel. And I love that picture. Think about that. Socrates lived around 450 BC. That Christ goes to the dead and says, and Justin kind of puts some flesh on it, and he's like, and says, Socrates, I am the truth you were trying to find. And Justin says, kind of puts on Socrates' lips, I accept. And it's this sort of, in a way, this has a rhetorical purpose to say, look, I'm trying to say philosophy as it points to Christianity. But it's also a really beautiful picture of the saving work of Christ in a world beyond its home setting, right? We're far afield from the Judaism of first century Palestine, right? Irenaeus of Lyon is a disciple of Polycarp, whose body looks like baked bread when he was burning. A zealous defender of the church. He wrote on the Apostolic Preaching, which is our primary source for the textures and varieties and teachings of all the Gnostics of his day. He wrote Against Heresies, that's the work, a big book, 5 volumes. And then on the Apostolic Preaching, which is where he sort of summarizes. One of the questions asked at break was a very good question, which I hope you'll have a sort of something of an answer for by the end of these next couple lectures. But here he actually records on the Apostolic Preaching, he doesn't mean this as an adjective, he means like, what did the apostles preach? Like, what was the message of Peter and Paul as we heard it? And he's writing it down third hand, right? So from Polycarp, second hand, from Polycarp who heard it from John. But he's also corroborating it with New Testament writings. So he's sort of synthesizing his reading of what was to him a New Testament, as well as what he learned in lived tradition, and says like, look, this is the faith as I received it. So if you want one great cross-section of what did people think the traditional faith was around the year 180, was I'll look at the Apostolic Preaching. That's a pretty good cross-section. It's a short book. It's good reading. Tertullian is the great curmudgeon. He was unhappy with what he lived in a period. His ministry was in a period between persecutions, between Marcus Aurelius and Severus. So he saw the next generation of Christians who forgot about persecution, kind of getting a bit lazy, and actually he became a rigorist in his later days, and actually the last 10 years of his life he spent with a sect called the Montanists, who were kind of into all kinds of crazy, but they were rigorous, and so he really liked that, and so he thought the church was too lax. But before he became a Montanist, he wrote these works, which are really profound reading. He actually wrote against Justin Martyr, and this attempt to sort of reconcile philosophy and Christian revelation. He famously said, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Right, as these are synecdoche for what does a house of philosophy have to do with a city where the Christ died? Like one is speculation, one is a concrete event. To tell you that philosophers of sort of historians of thought trace a lot of later existential, like Kierkegaard and stuff, some of these early existential thinkers, to Tertullian. Tertullian at one point says, look, I believe it because it's impossible. It's like, whoa, okay, like, that's pretty deep. So anyway, so then Hippolytus, Bishop of Rome, he gives us a great cross-section into the life of the worship of the church. He records, we have these records of sort of a communion as service and sort of what the disciplinary canons were. And if you go to a liturgical church, it's very similar to what liturgical churches still do today. Clement of Alexandria founded a school in Alexandria, one of the greatest epicenters of learning in the ancient world, right? Think of the Library of Alexandria, Philo of Alexandria. It's the stronghold of the Platonic and then later Neoplatonic traditions. He founds a school there. And so he's actually one of the ones to say, what's interesting is, so the Gnostics are saying, we are Gnostics and we have the pleroma of light in our bodies and our body, all this stuff. He said, no, we are the true Gnostics. He kind of does one of these word turnarounds. So I can remember it sort of in the history of, maybe in this last century, at first, for instance, the word queer was used very derisively and wickedly. I mean, in terms of it was a term of abuse. But then it got sort of reclaimed and sort of turned around and said, no, we'll take that term. And now there's sort of queer studies and sort of that word has become a moniker for a community to identify under positively. So there was a word flip around. What was meant as an abuse became a sort of claimed title. Same thing with Gnostics, sort of turning the word around and saying, no, we're the true Gnostics. I guess there's a bit of a difference there. But one of the things that too is he founds a school and sort of lays a cornerstone for all of Christian history to come of education is important. That if you develop the life of the mind, you have more capacity to receive the mystery of faith. So we'll see that come to full bloom in monasticism in our very last lecture and whatnot. But just good to point out that wasn't just a really late blooming movement. It was pretty early on. Origen of Alexandria is his greatest pupil, one of the greatest theologians of the early church, a devout student of the scriptures. He was such a great mind that, like all great minds, he was tempted to the fringes on the edge. And so there's a few ideas which he puts very tentatively, very humbly. Like in one writing, he says, maybe, perhaps, and I wouldn't say this out loud, but I think perhaps God might even reconcile the demons on the last day. And it's very, very cautious, but he's sort of taking into picture, and he is tempted a little bit by logic, I think. And so he writes that, and then 300 years later, as we're going to see 3 lectures from now, that gets kind of picked up on, and there's this movement that's called the apocatastatic movement. And they said, Origen was right, God's going to reconcile all things, universalism. And then they had to have a church council, and they called that a heresy. But Origen himself was pretty gentle about it, but he did write a little bit edgy at times. So, but he is a great teacher nonetheless. So now I want to end with the great responses that these early fathers develop in their writings in terms of giving foundational shape to the teaching and self-understanding of the church. So what is the normal traditional faith, and how do we know? That's what I want to look at. And so this is going to span our time to get to today, and we'll continue it next lecture. So first is they develop a reliance for truth claims on the Bible. So right away from the beginning, it wasn't the reformers of the 16th century who said it must be in the Bible for us to believe it. In these early contests for what is true, what did Jesus really teach? What is the church and how should we understand our role? The Bible assumed a place of paramount importance, and we see that crystal clear in the writings of the 2nd century fathers. Now wait a second. What Bible, right? So far, when they appeal to the Bible, we know the Old Testament, but what about the New Testament? What New Testament were they appealing to? So I want to do a brief excursus on the formation of the New Testament canon in the 2nd century. Because you need to know how they got that book, which they said was their really ground of authority. So I think that we see the sort of tiny seed of what would become of canon. So canon means plumb line, but it becomes the word for describing which books are included as in the New Testament as received as being written by God, as inspired by God himself. Like, how do you draw a circle around those books? Because lots of people wrote lots of things. Which ones are the words that you can take to the bank and, in fact, people would die for? And you could make arguments off of, and all would agree, oh, yeah, okay, well, if it's written in Colossians, we should submit to that, you know. Whereas, well, that's the epistle that Ignatius wrote. It's a great letter, but I disagree, you know. How do you draw the difference? The germ for canon discernment, this is Paul's letter to the Colossians, written in the late 50s, early 60s. He writes in chapter 4, when this letter, Colossians, has been read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans. And see that you also read the letter from Laodicea. So Paul's saying, swap letters. And it's the very act of swapping letters, which Paul enjoins here, but also happened naturally on many fronts, that is the beginning of canon formation. So what I mean is, where do we get the Bible? It's from the circulation of letters and the swapping notes of received apostolic teaching, for example, the Gospels. So you can picture the scene. So I wish I should have put a map up. Picture the Mediterranean and cities of the core cities of the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean, in which the apostles went very early on, Antioch in Syria and Rome in Italy and Alexandria and Jerusalem and all throughout Asia Minor, Ephesus and Smyrna. And there's all these cities, right? And Paul's writing these letters, and he's saying, copy those letters and send them to other things. And we know there's great infrastructure in the first century, roads and couriers and soldierly protection for couriers and all this sort of stuff. Everyone's speaking Greek. So these letters start swapping, and they make a copy, and they send a copy on, and they say, well, we want to keep a copy for ourselves before we send it along. And these letters just start circulating. And same thing with the Gospels. It's like, you know, if you're in Rome in the year 70, you have a copy in your hand of Mark's written Gospel, which he recorded from what he heard from the lips of Peter. And then someone comes from Ephesus and says, in the 80s or actually probably the 90s, and says, John wrote a Gospel too. And you're like, whoa, 2 Gospels, right? And you're like, well, I want to keep a copy of that. Well, you can't keep mine. I've got to take this on to the next church. Okay, well, we'll handwrite our own copy. And so there's a practice of handwriting and transmission and circulation. I sort of think of it like a whirlpool of water with like flotsam kind of sifting on the top. Like there's all this circulation. I have 2 little girls, both them and I, and the pool toys always kind of swirl together. And some pool toys sort of float to the top, and some kind of sink to the bottom in the midst of that swirling process. And that's what we see in sort of the earliest stages of New Testament canon formation. And what we see in different sort of historical markers is glimpses into what people were recognizing as the fruits of this process, which I'll come back to in just a second, which tells us, sort of gives us a glimpse of sort of how widespread are these writings? What do they know? So the Muratorian fragment is one of the foundational pieces of writing. It's dated to around the year 180. Scholars do disagree. I've read into it a few articles, and I'm convinced by the 180 date. But mostly because there's things which he mentions are possibly scripture, which is interesting, this sort of, again, this loose hand, like, oh, we know these are scripture, and these might possibly be scripture, which we know by Eusebius' time, when he writes his history in the very early 4th century, are no longer in the running. Like, no one in the 4th century thinks the Epistle to Barnabas is even possibly scripture. But the Muratorian fragment says this one might be. So for a scholar, I've yet to hear a scholar say, Muratorian fragment is, laid into the 3rd or 4th century, because it's like, no one's considering those arguments then. How is this just completely ignorant of what everyone else is saying? I don't know. So what's interesting is the Muratorian fragment references 22, there's 27 books in the New Testament as it sits today. It mentions 22 of them, right? And so again, this is just a snapshot. We don't know who wrote it or why. It's just a fragment. It just says, these are the books that we read in our church. And it includes all 4 Gospels, Acts, all 13 epistles of Paul, Jude, 1 John and 2 John, and maybe 3rd John. There's like a hole in the paper and it says 3, and then it's like 3, but then it might not be 3, so it's hard to say. But interestingly, it does include Revelation. When Irenaeus of Lyon, who we just looked at, is writing, he says this argument. He says, there have to be 4 Gospels, and only 4 Gospels, because there's 4 winds. Which is not an argument, right? To say that like north, south, east, west, therefore the 4. But what's interesting, when someone makes not an argument, or not a very good argument, it reveals that they're resting on something that they've received as just bedrock true, and are trying to scramble to defend, right? Like, so Irenaeus actually, for him, it's like a bedrock truth that there can be 4. What's interesting is there's a guy named Tatian in Syria who writes in the mid-2nd century, in the year like around 160, he writes a harmony of the Gospels called the Diatessaron, the from the 4, a single Gospel. And it's like, look guys, there's differences and discrepancies, and like John's more popular in Ephesus, and everyone loves Mark in Rome, and let me just bring it all together. And he writes this, and the church is like, no thank you. The church right away said, we'd rather have 4 things, even with their chronological disagreements, with their sort of apparent sort of here and there sort of different speakings and different witnesses, even on the face of it, contradictions. We'd rather have the 4 witnesses that we can trace to the apostles' mouths via a scribe in most cases, rather than the synthesis from who are you, Tatian? Right? Pedigree was important to them. So it's interesting that someone tried to iron out the wrinkles, and the church said, we'd rather have the wrinkles. Again, the breadth of mind of the early church. So what I want to say about the Bible is that it neither fell down bound in gilt leather from the sky, but nor was it ordered to be gathered from the top down. There's this sort of myth of like sort of the smoke-filled room of like, let's keep 2 Peter, but let's not keep the Gospel of Thomas. There's no trace of that in the early church. Instead, what we seem to have, according to sort of how the teachers speak about Scripture and these fragmentary glimpses from history, is that this circulatory process, there was actually a common existential experience in the reading of the writings that we now call the New Testament. That they would get a letter, because we know, if you read the Corinthian correspondence, Paul says in his first letter, he references a previous letter, and in his second letter, he references a letter that came between the first and the second. So there is a 1, 2, 3, and 4 Corinthians, but only 2 and 4 made the cut. 1 and 3, where are they? Who knows? They're just one. But because the church didn't have the same experience in reading them. Paul probably wrote a bunch of notes scattered around the place, undoubtedly. But the ones which got received as Scripture are the ones where the church read and they said, wow, like, as I read this, it's like when we heard Jesus preach. Or I actually feel God speaking. Is that crazy? And then they say, no, it's not crazy. This feels like when we read Isaiah and the promises of the lion laying down with the wolf laying down with the lamb. That same feeling we get when we read Peter's letters, And there was this sort of common experience that actually was very organic and grassroots up, right? There's no bishop, we don't get, do you know the first time from the top down the church said, these are the books of Scripture, don't ask any more questions? What year do you think that happened in? 1565. It wasn't deemed necessary until the contest of canon between Protestants and Roman Catholics. There was never a thing that said, this is it, top down, don't ask any more questions, until the Council of Trent, the last session of the Council of Trent. So, we get Athanasius, I'll come down to this in a bit. He writes, well, actually, I think I have a slide. So it really wasn't, again, it's a lived experience. And again, it's in harmony. One of the things that so often is forgotten, especially in late 19th, early 20th century New Testament scholarship, is that the canon is being formed within a community, that you have the living witnesses and their disciples there to be your cross-reference and your check. So when the Gospel of Thomas comes floating in, and you're sitting next to the guy who had John as his mentor, you can say, does this check out with you? I mean, did John ever breathe a word of anything that sounded like this? And you could say, and he would say, no, John doesn't say anything about it. Like this is just, where did this letter come from? Well, let's trace this project. Wait, some random guy in wherever Basilides is from? No, thank you. So there was that living witness which corroborated the writings as having an authentic witness and a truthful content. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No.
There was a Franciscan right now who writes kind of similarly, who says more than just the writings and knowledge is the mystical experience.
Yeah.
They're talking about that.
Yeah.
That combined with the writings.
Yeah. I think sociologically, we can't account for half of what we see in the history of the early church without assuming they had some sort of existential mystical experience. If this was just bare-bone facts of sort of like, oh yeah, like this is a date you should know and a thing that happened, that doesn't account for, I'm going to sell all my stuff and go be a missionary for that, So how many Gospels are there? Which books are authentic? The criteria that is used by the early church is it has to have a known history, a known progeny. And actually, this is just good historical work, right? With any document, you say, well, where's it from? Well, where did he get it from? And where was it before that? And to try and trace it back to its purported time of origin. It has to have a known history and provenance, tracing back to the time of the apostles, actually to the apostles themselves. If no one had heard of it before recent days, it can't be authentic. And how do we know that? And here's on a flag, just put in a flag for next week's lecture. Actually, I'm going to rush to it. Apostolic succession. And there must be 4 Gospels. I mentioned about that with Tatian. Okay, that's the end of the excursus. I want to come, I think I have it right here. So the fathers, that was the excursus. Remember, I'm talking about the 2nd century fathers. What responses do they develop to the heresies that arise? They develop evaluation of reasoning, education, and scholarship to defend the faith. So what's interesting is Origen, right around the turn of when the 2nd century rolled into the 3rd, he recognized that he had 2 copies of some of Paul's letters and tiny word differences here and there. So he went and asked all other cities that he was in touch with, in this place in the letter, what word do you have here? And then he actually did sort of thoughtful text criticism to say, oh, this word, someone misunderstood it for this one. And so right away they recognize that in transmission, sometimes there's a bit of white noise that gets in, and they're right away self-correcting for that. When the Greek scriptures get translated into Latin, and right away there's sort of critiques of the Latin translations from amidst the congregation. And then the people, there's such a spirit. I mean, one of the great gifts God has given the church is that the mass of mankind is generally stubborn to what it knows. So the Latin translation that the church that Jerome served in Palestine, their translation of this one passage in Jonah said that a gourd grew up. And Jerome was a good Hebrew scholar. He said, that's not a gourd, it's a vine. So he translated it with whatever the Latin word declined rightly as vine. And they read that translation in his church, and the whole congregation starts yelling over the priest, no, it's a gourd, it's a gourd, it's a gourd, right? The church was extremely conservative with its textual tradition very early on. And scholarship, to unpack it and to explain it. We see the scholarship in Justin Martyr and Alexandria, the founding of libraries, careful biblical scholarship, that's Origen I was just speaking about. And this is the note I wanted to end on, really fast. The revealing of significance of apostolic succession. Remember how we looked at that, like Peter appointing who would be his successor in Rome, and that being a tradition carried on kind of throughout all the early church. So that was just something that happened, right? Like Clement says in the year 90, he gives us a historical glimpse. The successors of the apostles were appointed, and we have a continuous sort of hand-to-hand kind of pass the baton of leadership. That's a fact, which the value of it gets uncovered 150 years into that process when these heresies come up and these Basilides and these guys say, we have the secret message of Jesus. All of a sudden, they realized they were sitting on this treasure trove of argumentation. And I'm not going to be able to read all this because it's 2:10, but here we go. I'm not going to read it. But against heresies, and I encourage you to read this, Irenaeus' argument is, look, I know who I learned the faith from. It was this guy. And let me name for you the 7 names between me and Peter in continuous succession. And none of us have ever heard anything about what Basilides is saying. So he just says, like, you decide who's more credible, the one who can trace his pedigree to Peter or the one who can't, and the one who can describe all of the teachings and the writings that were handed down from each of his successors, and that actually is our sort of bedrock of guarantee that this is the faith that's been passed down, that because it's underwritten by hand-to-hand off organic community leadership growing, continuing on, that was what underwrites the fact that as a check for the content remaining stable. So then when Basilides says the content's here, you can say, no, that's not what has been carried by our lived tradition ever since. So this is a good quote. I'd encourage you to read it. So he talks about, look, so he just names like Linus. Where does he name them? Somewhere. But so he says, look, there was Peter appointed, Linus appointed, Clement, Eversus, Alexander, Sixtus, Hyginus, Pius, Anicetus, Sota, Anicetus, Eleutherius, who was the one who Irenaeus says sent him on mission. So, being able to trace that succession, this is most abundant proof that there is one and the same vivifying faith, which has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now, and handed down in truth. And what he says is, if Jesus had a secret teaching, he would pass it on to his right-hand man. Who were his right-hand men in the Gospels? Peter, James, and John. And we got this from Peter, right? And he's saying, like, if anyone had secret knowledge, we'd have it. And there is no secret knowledge. It's all written there in the Gospels. So, okay, so we'll continue on this theme with next time. And I'll begin with a piece of historical fiction next time that will be fun as well. So, okay, thanks for coming. And sorry for going a bit over time.